"We need to escalate things," Jack said, his voice grim. "We have to make sure they can't shut us down. We have the evidence, but we need to get it to the right people, people who can protect us." Amy hesitated, then nodded. "I've got some contacts in high places, people who can help us get this out of the country if it comes to that. But we need to act fast." The clock was ticking. Jack could feel the walls closing in around him. Blackwell's machine was coming after them, and if they weren't careful, it would be too late to turn back. They had already made their move. Now, they needed to make sure it wasn't their last. The tipping point, Jack and Amy knew that the time for quiet action had passed. They couldn't just keep releasing bits and pieces of the story. They needed to go all in. They had the world's attention, but they needed more than just public outrage. They needed undeniable proof that would shake the system to its core. Amy arranged a meeting with a journalist, James Porter, who worked for an independent news outlet with a reputation for exposing corruption. Porter was skeptical at first. Jack could tell he was used to getting tips that led nowhere, but when Amy handed him a hard drive full of documents, recordings, and photographic evidence, his eyes widened in disbelief. This is gold," Porter said, his voice trembling with the weight of what he was holding. "This is bigger than I thought." Jack felt a pang of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. They were one step closer to exposing Blackwell and those behind him. But it wasn't over yet. As the meeting ended, Jack caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked across the street. It was too dark for him to see clearly, but the feeling in his gut told him everything he needed to know. "They're here," Jack muttered. "What do we do?" Amy asked, her voice tight. Jack looked at her, his jaw set in determination. "We don't stop. Not now, not ever." As the two of them walked quickly to their car, Jack knew that the next few hours would decide everything. They were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the lives of countless others who had been lied to, used, and betrayed. But as long as they had the truth on their side, they couldn't lose. The fight for justice was far from over. The night was thick with tension as Jack and Amy sped through the darkened streets. The SUV that had been following them had slipped away when they turned into a narrow alley, but Jack wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. He could still feel the eyes of Blackwell's enforcers on him, a weight on his chest that refused to lift. The further they went, the more Jack realized how deeply entangled he was in something much larger than just a corrupt politician. Blackwell was just the tip of the iceberg. There were bigger, more dangerous forces at play, forces that weren't going to let him walk away. "We need to get this information out, now," Amy said, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as they weaved through the empty streets. She glanced at Jack, her face drawn. "If we don't act fast, we'll be too late." Jack didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning, trying to anticipate the next move, trying to prepare for the inevitable. He had gone through hell in battle, but this was a different kind of war. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something far more important, the truth. "We will," Jack said finally, his voice steady. "But we need to do this right. We can't just hand this over to anyone. We need someone who can protect us, someone with enough power to stop Blackwell's machine from crushing us." Amy nodded. "I've got a contact, someone high up in the FBI. If we can get them to back us, we'll have the resources to go public, to make sure this story doesn't get buried." The plan seemed simple enough, but Jack had learned long ago that things were never simple. The more people they trusted, the more people who knew what they were doing, the higher the stakes. And Blackwell wasn't going to wait around for them to make their move. The clock was ticking. They pulled up to an old, run-down building on the edge of the city, its windows covered in grime and its front door barely hanging on its hinges. Amy didn't hesitate as she parked the car. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "The contact is waiting inside." Jack's stomach tightened, but he pushed the fear aside. This was the only chance they had to get their story out in the open. They couldn't afford to be scared, not now. As they walked up the cracked steps to the building, Jack noticed a shadow shift in one of the upstairs windows. The contact had to be inside. They reached the door and knocked 3 times, the echo of each strike resonating in the silence of the night. The door creaked open, revealing a tall man with sharp features and a calculating gaze. "You McAllister?" the man asked, his voice gruff but measured. "That's right," Jack replied, sizing the man up. "We need to talk." The man stepped aside to let them in, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The air inside the building was thick, damp, and musty, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. But none of that mattered. Jack's focus was on the man in front of him. This was their lifeline, the person who could turn the tide in their favor. "Name's David Griffin," the man said, offering a firm handshake. "FBI, I've been following Blackwell for a while, but I couldn't get close. You two, you've stirred up something big." "We've got the proof," Amy said, her voice steady. She handed Griffin the hard drive with all of the evidence. "This is everything. Blackwell's deals, his connections, his money laundering. We've got it all." Griffin took the hard drive, inspecting it briefly before sliding it into his laptop. His eyes scanned the documents, his face hardening with every page. Jack could see the moment the realization hit. This wasn't just a local scandal. This was national. The connections Blackwell had made, the level of corruption that had seeped into every aspect of government. It was all there in black and white. "Jesus Christ," Griffin muttered under his breath. This is bigger than I thought." "We need your help," Jack said. "We're running out of time. If Blackwell catches wind of this, we're dead." Griffin looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "You think I don't know that? I've been digging into Blackwell for months. I've got my own people watching him. But this could ruin everything. He's not just some politician, he's tied into things I can't even talk about." Jack didn't flinch. He had known the risks. He had known from the moment he exposed Blackwell that this was going to be bigger than just one man's corruption. It was going to shatter the political system as they knew it. "Then we do it together," Jack said. "We expose him, all of it. The whole country needs to know what he's done, and we need protection, now." Griffin hesitated. "It's not that easy. Blackwell has powerful allies, people who don't care about the law, who will go to any lengths to protect him. If I help you, it'll make me a target too. You have to understand what you're asking." "I know what I'm asking," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. "But we're not going to sit back and let him destroy everything we fought for. We're not going to let him win." Griffin sighed and leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk as he thought. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity, and then, finally, he spoke. "All right," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll help you. But we do this my way. We leak the information to the press, to the right people. We make sure Blackwell's untouchable allies don't have the time to cover this up. And I'm pulling in every favor I've got to protect you two." Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. It was happening. They were going to take down Blackwell and expose the corruption that had festered for far too long. But as Griffin stood up to make the first call to set the plan into motion, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as Griffin picked up his phone, Jack's instinct screamed at him. He spun around, scanning the dark corners of the room. He could feel it, the eyes on him, the weight of someone else in the shadows. Before he could say anything, the door to the building flew open with a deafening bang. A group of masked men stormed in, weapons raised, their faces cold and unreadable. Jack's pulse spiked, and he instinctively reached for his sidearm, but it was too late. They had them cornered. "You shouldn't have come here, McAllister," one of the men said, his voice masked by the sound of heavy breathing. "This is the end of the line." The masked men moved quickly, their heavy boots slamming against the floor, and before Jack could even react, the air was thick with tension and the sharp scent of fear. He had been in firefights before, but this wasn't one of them. This was a trap. The first man lunged toward Amy, and instinct kicked in. Jack grabbed his sidearm, aiming at the aggressor's legs to disable him before he reached Amy. But in the split second he moved, a fist connected with the side of his face, sending his head reeling. His vision blurred momentarily, and he stumbled back, barely keeping his feet. "Down!" someone shouted from the back of the group. It was a deep, commanding voice. Another masked figure stepped forward, his hand gripping the butt of a gun. "Get on the floor, McAllister, now!" Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't going to let them take him down like this. Not now, not after everything he had been through. But before he could retaliate, Amy's voice cut through the chaos. "Jack, don't!" Amy screamed, her voice thick with urgency. "They want us alive!" She was right. These men weren't aiming to kill, not yet. They wanted something else. Blackwell's men were efficient, calculating, and they knew how to play the long game. Jack took a deep breath, his grip still firm on his gun. He scanned the room, calculating his chances. They were surrounded, outnumbered, but not out of options. He needed to buy time. "Who sent you?" Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the rage that was building inside him. "Who's pulling the strings?" One of the men stepped forward, his mask twisted in mock amusement. "You're too late, McAllister. You think exposing Blackwell will stop this? You're just a small part of a much bigger picture. Bigger than you, bigger than the law. You've stepped into a world you'll never understand." A cold chill ran down Jack's spine. These weren't just the hired hands. These were soldiers, people with connections that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. "What do you want?" Amy asked, her voice shaking slightly, but she held her ground beside Jack. "We want the hard drive, all the files," the masked man growled. "You've seen what happens to people who don't cooperate." Jack's mind raced. The hard drive contained everything, every last shred of evidence they had gathered. Without it, everything they had done would be in vain. He couldn't afford to lose it. "Make a move," Jack warned, his voice cold. "You won't leave here alive." The man laughed, the sound hollow and chilling. "You really think you can stop us? We've already got people in high places. You're nothing but a pawn in a game far beyond your understanding. If you keep pushing, I promise you won't make it out of here." Amy's eyes locked onto Jack's, a silent understanding passing between them. They both knew what needed to be done. There was no time to hesitate, no room for doubt. They had to fight their way out. Suddenly, Jack's military instincts kicked into high gear. He lunged forward, using the momentum to knock the closest man to the ground, his gun flying out of reach. Amy followed suit, disarming another attacker in a swift motion, catching him off guard with a swift jab to the gut and a vicious elbow to the head. It was chaos. The room became a blur of motion, the sounds of fists hitting flesh, the sharp crack of gunfire as Jack fired warning shots into the ceiling, creating a distraction. For a brief moment, the men hesitated, their focus split. That's all Jack needed. "Run!" he shouted at Amy. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." They moved fast, ducking behind crates, using whatever cover they could find. But the men were closing in. The space they were fighting in was too tight, and soon Jack could feel their breath on his neck, could hear the crackle of their radios as they called for reinforcements. But in the heat of the moment, Jack saw an opening. There was a narrow passageway to the back of the building, hidden behind a set of stacked boxes. He made a split-second decision and gestured to Amy. "This way!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the escape route. They sprinted toward the back of the building, hearing the shouts of their pursuers echoing in the narrow halls. The sound of footsteps pounding behind them spurred them forward, adrenaline propelling them faster. As they reached the end of the corridor, Jack kicked open a metal door. It led outside to a small alley. The cool night air hit him like a slap to the face, but there was no time to savor the relief. The sound of engines revving told him they weren't out of the woods yet. "Go!" Jack barked, pushing Amy ahead of him. He looked back one last time before stepping into the alley. Just as the door slammed behind them, a black SUV came screeching around the corner, headlights blinding them in the dark. Jack pushed Amy into the alleyway's shadows just in time as the vehicle slowed to a halt. He could hear voices inside, but he didn't dare look out from their hiding spot. If they were found here, it would all be over. Amy turned to him, her breathing heavy, her face pale but determined. "We can't stop now," she said, voice low but steady. "We need to get the rest of this information to Griffin. We're not done." Jack nodded grimly. "We won't stop. Not until Blackwell's done." They stayed hidden in the shadows, watching as the SUV slowly backed up and pulled away, unaware of their presence. When the vehicle was out of sight, and Jack and Amy made their move, slipping through the back streets, dodging the occasional patrol car, always staying out of view. It wasn't until they reached a safe house Amy had arranged with a former contact that they allowed themselves a moment to breathe. But even then, the tension between them was palpable. "They won't stop," Jack said, pacing. "This goes all the way to the top. Blackwell's not the end of this. It's just the beginning." Amy nodded, her eyes cold with resolve. And we're going to make sure the rest of the country knows that. We expose him, and everything he's tied to." Jack looked at the hard drive in his hand. Everything they had worked for, every piece of evidence. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going down without a fight. The world had shifted. The moment they had set the truth into motion, there was no going back. But as Jack and Amy huddled together in the small, dingy safe house, it became painfully clear that the cost of this fight would be far higher than they had anticipated. They had managed to escape the ambush, but Blackwell's reach stretched far and wide, deeper than Jack had ever imagined. The hard drive in his hands felt heavier now, its contents a ticking time bomb. Every moment they held it, Blackwell's enforcers were closing in, hunting them down, determined to silence them before the truth could fully be exposed. Amy was pacing nervously, running a hand through her hair. "We need to get this to Griffin. If we don't, everything we've done won't matter." Jack watched her, his mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. They were being hunted, their every move tracked. Griffin, their last lifeline, was the only person who could ensure the hard drive reached the right hands, the hands of people who could protect them, protect the truth. They needed to trust him. But in the back of Jack's mind, a small voice kept whispering, "How long before they come for Griffin?" "There's no time to waste," Jack said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "We're taking the drive to him tonight. If we wait any longer, they'll have us cornered. We can't give them that chance." Amy nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I'll get the car ready." They moved quickly, each one feeling the weight of the decision hanging over them. The truth had been unleashed, but now they had to get it out of the shadows and into the light. The night felt endless, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But the quiet was deceptive, because they were not alone. As they made their way through the back streets, Jack's hand hovered near the gun, holstered at his side. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every turn, every stoplight, every alley they passed felt like a trap. He tried to remain calm, but the constant pressure of knowing that Blackwell's men were closing in kept him on edge. Suddenly there it was, the unmistakable hum of an engine too close for comfort. Jack's instincts flared, and he grabbed Amy's arm, pulling her into a tight corner behind a dumpster. They stayed still, barely breathing as a black SUV cruised past, its headlights briefly illuminating their hiding spot. It slowed to a stop, just a few feet from where they were crouched. Jack's heart was pounding. He could hear the voices from inside the SUV, low, gruff, and urgent. They were searching. They were looking for them. "We need to go," Jack whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. "Now!" He motioned for Amy to move, and they darted into the next alley, sticking to the shadows. Jack knew that if they didn't reach Griffin soon, they wouldn't just be fighting for the truth. They'd be fighting for their lives. As they sprinted through the maze of alleys, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. It was a game of cat and mouse, but this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. Jack's thoughts kept flickering back to the safe house, the place that had been their temporary sanctuary. It had been a good spot, well hidden, but even it couldn't protect them forever. They had to move, had to stay one step ahead. Finally, they reached the drop-off point. Griffin had told them to meet at an old, nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, but Jack had learned not to trust appearances. Every instinct told him to be wary. Amy stepped out of the car first, moving cautiously. Jack followed close behind, scanning the area, every sense alert. The warehouse loomed before them, its rusted doors hanging half open. It was too quiet. Jack stopped in his tracks, a cold shiver crawling down his spine. There was something wrong. He could feel it in his bones. He turned to Amy, his voice low. "Something's off. Stay close." Amy glanced nervously at the warehouse. "Maybe he's inside." Jack didn't answer. His gut was telling him they weren't alone. They were walking right into a trap. Just then, the sound of a door creaking echoed from behind them. Before Jack could react, a cold voice rang out, clear and sharp in the still night air. "Well, well, well. You two really thought you could win, huh?" Jack spun around, his hand already reaching for his gun, but the figure that stepped into view stopped him cold. It was David Griffin. But it wasn't the Griffin they had come to trust. The man who had been their ally, who had promised them protection, was now standing before them, holding a gun with a cold smirk on his face. "You?" Jack breathed, disbelief flooding his voice. "Griffin, What the hell is this? Griffin's expression was unreadable, his eyes hard as stone. You really didn't think I'd let you take that information and just walk away, did you, McAllister? You've been a pawn in this game since the beginning. I never thought you'd get this far, but now, well, it's time to finish what I started. Amy's voice trembled as she stepped back. You were with them the whole time? Griffin's laugh was dark, almost predatory. You were useful for a while, but the moment you exposed Blackwell, you became a liability. And liabilities, well, they have to be eliminated. Jack's blood ran cold. The hard drive, the very thing that could bring down Blackwell, was now in Griffin's hands. The betrayal stung more than anything he'd felt before. Griffin had been part of their plan, part of their last hope. Now, it was all crashing down. I don't care who you're working for, Jack said, his voice steady though the fury boiled beneath the surface. You'll never get away with this. Griffin didn't flinch. You're too late. This isn't about me or Blackwell anymore. This is about power. You think you can expose everything and walk away with your lives? This is the real world, McAllister. People like you don't win. Before Jack could make his next move, Griffin's men stepped out from the shadows, their weapons drawn, closing in on them. Amy stepped forward, her hands raised in the air, trying to stall them. Jack, she said softly, we need to end this. Now. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let this be the end. They had come too far, fought too hard to let it all be in vain. He locked eyes with Amy, who nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken plan between them. In one swift motion, Jack threw a smoke grenade at Griffin's feet, the explosion of smoke filling the air. It was enough to disorient Griffin and his men for a split second. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed Amy's hand, pulling her toward a nearby door, slamming it shut behind them. They were in a narrow hallway, but there was no time to think. They could hear Griffin's men scrambling outside, their footsteps quick and angry. Amy pulled out her phone. We need to get the hard drive to the media, now. Jack nodded. Get it to them, Amy. They can't stop us now. As they hurried through the dark hallway, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But as they emerged into the alley, he felt the rush of adrenaline flood his veins. They were still alive, still in the game. And the truth would get out, no matter the cost. John Jack McAllister wasn't the same man who had left for war. The years he spent in foreign lands, fighting in countless battles, enduring loss, and witnessing the brutality of war, had changed him forever. Now, as he stood on the quiet suburban street in front of his modest home, he felt the weight of those years bearing down on him, heavy like an anchor lodged deep in his chest. The man who had once commanded soldiers on the battlefield was now trying to find a place to belong in a world that seemed indifferent to the sacrifices he had made. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. Back home, Jack tried to adjust, but nothing seemed to fit. The television blared in the background, news anchors speaking of the latest political developments. But Jack found himself tuning them out. He had no interest in the politics that had been so far removed from his life. That was until one name started appearing again and again on his screen: Senator Marcus Blackwell. Blackwell had been a hero once, a decorated veteran of several tours overseas. He was the kind of man Jack had looked up to. He had spoken about the nation's future, about the importance of supporting veterans, and about the power of unity. Blackwell's speeches were full of promise, but over the years, something about him started to feel off. Jack couldn't place it, but it was as if Blackwell's words didn't match his actions. One evening, Jack sat in a dimly lit bar, nursing a glass of bourbon. His gaze wandered over the crowd, locals from his town, veterans like him, all trying to get through their lives. As the conversation around him grew louder, Jack overheard a snippet of a conversation between two men sitting at the bar. Their words were sharp, low, and full of veiled hostility. "You hear about Blackwell?" one man said, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. "He's been taking money from those people, the ones with the shady business deals. I heard they're getting veterans funds in return." The other man snorted. "No surprise. He's always been a snake. You think he cares about us? He's got his own pockets to fill." Jack's ears perked up. He knew Blackwell's public persona, his speeches, his promises to veterans, but this was the first time he was hearing anything like this. The rumors were worse than he expected. The idea that Blackwell, a man who had once served beside them, might be using his influence to exploit the very people he claimed to support, made Jack's blood run cold. But he didn't jump to conclusions. He knew better than anyone that rumors often had no truth behind them. Still, something gnawed at him. Jack couldn't ignore it. That night, he made a decision. He would dig deeper into Blackwell's dealings, just to see if there was any truth to what he had overheard. It would be a personal investigation. No badges, no reporters, no cameras. Just a man searching for answers. Jack spent the next few days observing, listening, and digging for clues. He didn't have the resources of a professional investigator, but he had something more valuable: experience. Years of navigating the chaotic environments of war had taught him how to pick up on small details, read people, and trust his instincts. And right now, his instincts told him that something was terribly wrong with Senator Blackwell. The first lead came from a quiet meeting at a local diner, one of those places where the food was greasy and the conversations were just loud enough to overhear. Jack knew a few of the regulars there, mostly veterans who spent their mornings swapping stories and talking about the good old days. He wasn't surprised when one of them, a man named Frank Dillard, approached him at the counter. Frank had always been a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but Jack had a soft spot for him. He trusted Frank's street-smart instincts, even if they sometimes wandered into the realm of paranoia. "Jack, you ain't been watching the news much, huh?" Frank asked, his voice a little too loud for comfort. He looked over his shoulder, then leaned in closer. "You hear what Blackwell's been up to? The man's as crooked as they come. Hell, I saw a guy at the VFW the other day. He's been working with some foreign interests, man. Blackwell's been lining his pockets with military contracts, and no one's saying a damn thing." Jack's eyes narrowed. This was exactly what he had been suspecting. "What kind of foreign interests?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual, but the urgency behind his words was unmistakable. Frank glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "You know those guys who've been funding the Black Ops? The ones who get their hands on military contracts and do dirty work overseas? Blackwell's been taking money from them. I don't know how deep it goes, but the whispers are there. Big money, Jack, and veterans' benefits are getting slashed for it." Jack's heart raced. Blackwell had always promised better support for veterans, but now it seemed like the promises had been nothing more than empty words. The veteran community, the very people Blackwell claimed to protect, were being robbed for the benefit of shady backers. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, the trust that Jack and his brothers in arms had placed in a man they thought had their backs. But Jack needed more than just hearsay. He had to gather hard evidence. He couldn't let the anger and frustration cloud his judgment. This was bigger than just him. This was about exposing the truth for everyone who had ever been lied to. Over the next few weeks, Jack used his skills to gather intel. He tapped into his network of former soldiers, some of whom were now contractors working in private security or arms deals. He even managed to get his hands on a few documents that hinted at irregularities in Blackwell's financial dealings. But it wasn't until he received an encrypted email that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The email contained a recording of a phone conversation between Blackwell and an unknown foreign representative. The content of the call was chilling. The voice on the other end of the line was speaking in a thick accent, but Jack could still make out the key parts of the conversation. It was a deal where Blackwell was orchestrating the misallocation of military funds in exchange for a cut of the profits. The deal was vague enough to avoid outright incrimination, but the mention of certain veterans' programs being compromised was clear. Jack's hands shook as he listened to the recording. There was no denying it now. Blackwell wasn't just a corrupt politician, he was a criminal. With the evidence in hand, Jack knew it was time to act. He had no intention of letting Blackwell off the hook. The world needed to know what kind of man he truly was, and Jack was going to make sure of it. He didn't care that he was just one man. He had fought battles much harder than this. He knew what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were against him. Jack spent the next few days preparing. He contacted a trusted former colleague, Sergeant Amy Torres, now an investigative journalist. Amy had a reputation for uncovering corruption in high places, and if anyone could help Jack get the story out, it was her. The two of them met at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place they both knew would offer the privacy they needed. "Jack," Amy said, her voice calm but firm. "I've seen the pieces you've gathered. It's all there. Blackwell's connections, his dealings. But you need to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. We're not just taking down a politician here. We're going up against a system that's been in place for decades. People like Blackwell don't just fall. They fight back. Hard." "I don't care," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for the men I fought beside. I'm doing it for the people he's betrayed, the ones who trusted him." Amy nodded, her expression softening. "I get it. We'll do it right, but you have to be ready for the fallout. Once we expose this, there's no going back." Jack didn't need to be reminded. He had faced the horrors of war and had come back to find that some battles were far from over. This fight for justice, was the one that mattered most. The night was crisp, the streets deserted, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he sat in Amy's car, parked in an alley just a few blocks from the office of the local news station. They had made the decision to go public, to use every ounce of the damning evidence they had collected and expose Senator Marcus Blackwell for the fraud he truly was. But Jack knew that once they did this, there would be no turning back. He wasn't just confronting a corrupt politician, he was challenging an entire system that had protected men like Blackwell for decades. Amy had set up a meeting with a trusted news anchor, David Fisher, who had a reputation for covering corruption in high places. Fisher was known for his no-nonsense approach and his willingness to risk it all for the truth. Amy had briefed him on the evidence, and tonight was the night they would release the story to the world. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. He had always been a man of action, someone who thrived in the chaos of combat. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a political war, and the stakes were higher than anything he had faced before. "Are you ready for this?" Amy asked, her eyes scanning the street. Her hands were steady, but Jack could see the tension in her jaw. "I'm ready," Jack said, though the truth was he wasn't sure what ready really meant. He had spent years fighting on foreign soil, facing down insurgents, terrorists, and everything in between. But exposing Blackwell's corruption, putting a target on his own back in the process, was something he had never prepared for. Amy nodded, then glanced over at the glowing screen of her laptop. She sent the final encrypted files to Fisher's team, ensuring the entire package of evidence was locked and loaded. "It's done. We go live in 15 minutes. The silence between them was thick with anticipation. Jack's mind raced, replaying every moment of the investigation, the conversations, the documents, the recording of Blackwell's shady dealings with foreign powers. It was all real. There was no denying it anymore. "Here we go," Amy murmured as Fisher's voice came through her earpiece. The screen in front of them flashed with an alert, live broadcast in 10 seconds. The countdown echoed in Jack's mind. His palms grew clammy. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the magnitude of the truth they were about to unleash. Once the world knew the extent of Blackwell's betrayal, there would be no coming back for the senator. But Jack also knew that it wouldn't be just Blackwell who would suffer. They would come for him too, Blackwell's allies, his supporters, the system that had kept him in power. As the broadcast went live, the first words out of Fisher's mouth were calm, but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. "Tonight, we bring you a story that will shake the foundations of Washington. A former war hero turned politician, Senator Marcus Blackwell, has been accused of involvement in a multi-million-dollar corruption scheme. We've obtained evidence that implicates the senator in illegal deals with foreign interests and military contractors, all at the expense of the veterans he promised to support." The camera zoomed in on Fisher's face, and the background behind him shifted to the raw footage of Jack and Amy, standing side by side, the evidence in their hands. Jack's face appeared on the screen, eyes sharp, jaw set in a firm line. "I'm Jack McAllister," Jack said, his voice unwavering, "a former soldier who fought for this country. I was one of the many who trusted Marcus Blackwell. But what I've uncovered is a betrayal of everything we fought for. Blackwell isn't the hero he claims to be. He's a man who used his power to fill his own pockets and leave the very people he swore to protect in the dust." The footage cut to a series of documents, recordings, and photographs, all presented as hard evidence. The phone call between Blackwell and his foreign associates played over the loudspeakers, leaving no room for doubt. The deal was clear. The senator had been orchestrating a massive corruption scheme involving military contracts, money laundering, and stolen veterans' funds. It was ugly, and it was real. The backlash was immediate, and it was swift. Within minutes of the broadcast, Blackwell's office issued a statement, calling the accusations outrageous and false, insisting that they were part of a smear campaign orchestrated by those with a personal vendetta. But the damage had already been done. Social media exploded with outrage. News outlets picked up the story. Calls for Blackwell's resignation came flooding in from every corner of the country. But it wasn't just the public that began to turn. The pressure was mounting from within Blackwell's own party. Several senators, who had once stood by him, began to distance themselves. Whispers of investigations into his financial records started circulating in the halls of Congress. For Jack, it felt like the world had shifted. The story was out there. People were talking. But the real fight had only just begun. Within hours of the broadcast, Jack received a call from an unknown number. He answered it with caution. "McAllister," a low, gravelly voice said on the other end, "you've made a very dangerous mistake." Jack's pulse quickened. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Gordon Slate, a key member of Blackwell's political machine. Slate was the kind of man who operated in the shadows, pulling strings and making sure Blackwell's deals stayed hidden. "What do you want, Slate?" Jack asked, his voice calm but laced with underlying fury. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," Slate replied. "We're willing to overlook this little stunt of yours if you walk away. But if you keep going down this path, McAllister, you'll regret it." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. He knew exactly what Slate was threatening. It wasn't just Jack's life on the line anymore. It was his reputation, his safety, and everyone who had supported him. "I'm not backing down," Jack said, his voice firm. "You can try to intimidate me, but I'm not going anywhere. The truth is out, Slate. The people are waking up." There was a long silence on the other end. "You're making a mistake," Slate said coldly. "A big one. You have no idea how far we'll go to protect Blackwell. You're already in way over your head." The line went dead. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he sat back in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But now that he had stepped into this fight, he wasn't about to let anyone push him out. If Blackwell thought he could silence him, he had another thing coming. Amy glanced over at Jack. "They're going to come after us. Hard." "I know," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. "But we've got the truth on our side, and that's something they can't take away." The days following the broadcast were a blur of media frenzy, mounting pressure and rising danger. What had once been an isolated fight for justice had quickly morphed into something far larger. Jack could feel the heat on his back as the storm he had unleashed gained momentum, and with each passing hour, it became clear that Blackwell and his associates would stop at nothing to silence him. The phone calls and messages started the day after the broadcast, each one more menacing than the last. Unknown numbers, low whispers, threats veiled in calm tones. But Jack had been through worse. He'd survived hell in the deserts of Afghanistan, stared down enemies with weapons aimed at him, and weathered physical and emotional scars that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wasn't going to back down now, not when the truth was finally being heard. Amy was with him every step of the way. She had become more than just a colleague. She was a partner in this fight. They spent long nights in her cramped apartment, combing through documents, reviewing recordings, and preparing for what would come next. They knew that once the tide turned, there would be no stopping Blackwell's machine, but they were ready to stand their ground. As the media storm intensified, Jack's life became a whirlwind of interviews, press conferences, and social media uproar. At first, it seemed like the public was on his side, the people wanted answers, and they wanted Blackwell to be held accountable. But as Jack's face became more recognizable, as the coverage grew more intense, the true scope of the political retaliation began to unfold. Jack's first warning came in the form of an anonymous package delivered to his doorstep. Inside was a photograph of his home, taken from a distance. No note, no message, just a reminder that someone was watching. It was a silent threat, one that Jack couldn't ignore. He immediately contacted Amy, and the two of them discussed their next steps. They knew this was just the beginning. The people behind Blackwell weren't going to give up easily. The second warning was more direct. Jack had just finished a press interview when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered it, expecting another angry political figure or journalist seeking his side of the story. Instead, it was Slate's voice again, this time cold and dangerous. "You think you've won, McAllister?" Slate growled. "You're nothing more than a puppet in this game. You've pissed off the wrong people, and now you're going to pay the price. You're a dead man walking." Before Jack could respond, Slate hung up, but the words lingered in the air, heavy with threat. It was no longer just about Blackwell. It was about power, control, and keeping the status quo intact. Jack's exposure of Blackwell's corruption had opened a Pandora's box, and those with a vested interest in keeping the system running smoothly were willing to do anything to shut him down. But Jack wasn't about to let fear control him. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back. He made the decision to go public with everything. Every document, every recording, every shred of evidence they had gathered. He was going to take it straight to the people. If they were going to come for him, they would have to deal with the truth he was carrying with him. Amy set up a final press conference. This one would be different. It wasn't just about exposing Blackwell anymore. It was about making sure that no one could ever bury the story again. The whole country would see what Jack had uncovered, and this time, it wasn't going to be easy for Blackwell to spin it away. The night before the press conference, Jack received one more call. It was Amy, her voice tight with urgency. "Jack, I just got off the phone with someone from the inside. It's bad. They're planning something." "What do you mean?" Jack's voice sharpened, his instincts kicking in. "They're setting you up. They've got a plan to make you look like the bad guy. They're going to pull every string they can to discredit you. You've seen it happen before. They'll twist the story, use your past against you. They're not just going after your reputation, they're going after your life." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew Amy was right. It wasn't just about stopping the story, it was about erasing him. If Blackwell and his associates had their way, they would make sure Jack was either locked away or completely ruined, discredited beyond repair. "We have to be ready," Jack said, his voice steady. "We'll face them head on. If they want to fight, they're gonna get one." The press conference was set to go live at 10 a.m. the following morning. As Jack stood backstage, the weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him. The past few days had been a blur of chaos, but now there was clarity. This was the moment that would either make or break everything. Amy stood beside him, her face set in a mask of determination. The room filled with journalists and reporters, all eager for the next big scoop. But they didn't know the half of it. As Jack stepped up to the podium, the camera flashes went off, blinding him for a split second. He steadied himself, knowing that every eye in the room was on him. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was the embodiment of truth, standing before a nation that needed to hear what he had to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the room. "I'm here today because I've seen the truth. I've seen a man who was once hailed as a hero betray everything he stood for. Senator Marcus Blackwell is not the patriot he claims to be. He is a criminal, a liar, and a man who has put his greed above the lives of the very people he swore to protect." He gestured to the large screen behind him, which lit up with images of Blackwell's shady dealings. Documents, contracts, and recordings flashed on the screen, each piece of evidence damning and irrefutable. "This is what they don't want you to see," Jack continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This isn't just about one man's corruption. This is about a system that has allowed it to happen for years. This is about the veterans who've been used, the people who've been lied to, and the soldiers who paid the price for the greed of those in power. I won't back down, and neither should you." The room fell silent. The cameras rolled, capturing every word. Jack could feel the eyes of the nation upon him. He knew that this was the moment where the fight would truly begin. He wasn't just exposing Blackwell anymore. He was igniting a movement. The broadcast reached millions across the country, and within hours, social media exploded. Blackwell's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. The footage, the evidence, the truth, it couldn't be denied. The pressure on Blackwell mounted, and for the first time, the political machine that had protected him began to crack. But just as Jack thought he had taken the first step toward victory, the phone call came. This time, it wasn't from Blackwell's camp. It was from an unknown number, a voice on the other end that sent a chill down his spine. "You've made a grave mistake, McAllister," the voice said, cold and calculating. "You don't know who you're really messing with." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack's instincts told him that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The phone call echoed in Jack's mind long after it ended. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Whoever was behind this, whoever had been pulling Blackwell's strings for all these years, they were not going to let him get away with exposing their secrets. He knew what it meant. They were coming for him now. The following days felt like a whirlwind. The news coverage was relentless, the public outrage growing by the hour. Protesters gathered outside Blackwell's office, chanting for his resignation, demanding that he face justice. Politicians who had once stood by him were starting to break ranks, sensing the tide of public opinion turning against the powerful senator. But Jack wasn't just a bystander in this fight. He had ignited it, and now he was its focal point. As the days passed, the threats became more real. Jack's life had never felt more exposed. It wasn't just the phone calls or the menacing glances from strangers on the street. It was the constant weight of knowing that every move he made was being watched. His routine had been shattered. He couldn't leave his house without fearing an ambush, couldn't trust anyone without wondering if they had been paid to betray him. Amy had been his anchor through it all, but even she was starting to feel the pressure. Jack could see the fatigue in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she worked late into the night. They were in this together, but the stakes were rising faster than they could keep up. One evening, just as Jack was sitting down to a quiet dinner, there was a knock at the door. He froze. It was late, and the neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. He had learned not to ignore his instincts, and right now, every part of him was screaming to stay alert. Slowly, he moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. A man stood outside, his face hidden in the shadows. Jack didn't recognize him, but something about his presence felt off. "Can I help you?" Jack called, his voice low. The man didn't respond immediately. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He held it up, a signal that he wasn't going to leave until Jack took it. Jack's mind raced. Was this another warning, a threat, or something more serious? His hand rested on the door handle, but instead of opening it, he took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "Who sent you?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice calm. The man's voice came out low and controlled. "Take the envelope. You'll want to read it." Jack hesitated, but something in the man's eyes told him he wasn't going to leave without it. Reluctantly, Jack opened the door just enough to reach out and grab the envelope. He didn't break eye contact with the stranger. As soon as he had the envelope in his hand, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night without another word. Jack slammed the door shut behind him, heart pounding. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, its contents unknown, but the weight of it seemed to carry an ominous message. He sat down at the kitchen table, slowly tearing open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. Jack unfolded it and read the words scrawled across the page in black ink. "You've made a mistake. Turn back now, or you'll pay the price. Your investigation ends here. If you continue, the consequences will be severe. You've been warned." The message was direct and chilling, a clear threat not just against him, but against everyone he cared about. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the people involved in this conspiracy. Blackwell's associates, the shadowy figures pulling strings behind the scenes. They weren't playing games anymore. They were ready to take action, and Jack knew that his life, and Amy's, were on the line. He immediately called Amy, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to meet, now." Within the hour, Amy arrived at his house, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The weight of the situation was beginning to take its toll on both of them, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Jack handed her the envelope, his fingers still trembling. She read the message, her face hardening as she finished it. "This is bad. They're not just going to let us walk away. We need to take this seriously, Jack. If they're making threats like this, we have to assume that they'll follow through." Jack nodded. He had no illusions about what was at stake. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. This was survival. They had already exposed Blackwell's crimes to the world, but the powers behind him weren't about to let it go. They would come after him, physically, emotionally, and financially, until he was nothing but a broken man.